All right, Dom, welcome to the podcast. I'm thrilled to have you here today.
I'm thrilled to be on. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and I'm excited to have you on the show because we were just talking in the pre-chat, and we're going to talk all things keto, as much research around women as we can relate it to in terms of your understanding. And I also want to talk about some of the common, we'll say, objections or common, where people run into trouble with the ketogenic diet. So I want to talk about cholesterol, maybe exogenous ketone supplementation, and thyroid metabolism, exercise and fasting, all the stuff that I am commonly asked. And, you are very much regarded as, we'll call you the king of keto, maybe, but, someone who's very well versed in TM, but someone who's very well versed in the literature and the scientific application of it. So I wanted to explore some of these topics with you to see, where you stand on them, what the current literature is directing, and that can help some of the clinicians who also listen to this podcast as well to help with their directives as well.
Yeah.
So good. Yeah, let's start with the benefits of ketosis. I think that I have, in my clinical practice, I have found an enormous amount of benefits for a therapeutic intervention of ketosis, whether that's a short delta, long delta, depends on the person. But let's assume for the purposes of this conversation that we will define a person as healthy, and by healthy we mean they don't have any egregious lab markers. We'll talk about labs today as well, but they've heard of the ketogenic diet. They're interested in the ketogenic diet. What would be some of the benefits that an otherwise healthy person to starting the ketogenic diet? What would those be?
Yeah, well, I'll describe it from my point of view, and I think as you're very well versed and you articulate very well and have a community of women, and I think things are different with women. But from my perspective, I handle fasting very well. So I started, getting into sort of intermittent fasting and understanding that the more I did it, the more fat adapted I became and the easier it became to do, and the faster I got into ketosis. And I got into studying the ketogenic diet because my research program was looking at seizures, tonic-clonic seizures that were a consequence of oxygen toxicity, central nervous system oxygen toxicity, which limits Navy SEAL divers. It's also a limitation of hyperbaric oxygen therapy. You can only go up so high in pressure and you'll induce a seizure. So we were investigating the mechanisms of that, and I wanted to fully understand mechanistically, why it was working, but I wanted to do it myself in addition to that. And I did the medical ketogenic diet, which is very high in fat, moderate in protein. And the benefits that I experienced, it was very hard to implement and sustain on a daily basis. And that's another question. We could talk about cyclic ketogenic diet. But I did lose strength in the gym, but after about 2 months, maybe 3 months, I started my strength got back to stable, and I started to increase strength as I started adjusting my protein. But what I really experienced, and in the world of academia, where you're just kind of stuck in the lab or teaching all day, is that it controlled my appetite, unlike anything I had ever experienced, because I had a ravenous appetite, and it was able to two things. Mostly, the benefits were it prevented my appetite from controlling me. So usually I would have to stop what I was doing, in the lab, the experiment or whatever, and then go eat. But being fat adapted in a state of ketosis, your glycemic variability is very controlled. And I think that's a big part of it. And your hormones are kind of balanced in a way, I think, to prevent, you're satiated after you eat a ketogenic meal. And that's a big part of it too. Fat delays gastric absorption, and you have more steady energy flow over time. And the big thing was I was able to get more work done. So I gradually sort of transitioned in 2008, I believe, to eating this way. And I kind of stuck with it. And then the medical community published on the modified ketogenic diet or the modified Atkins diet. And that was Eric Kossoff at Johns Hopkins. And I was really, my only knowledge of the ketogenic diet was through the epilepsy literature. And it was shown that people on a modified ketogenic diet, which was much higher in protein, it went from like 10% to like 20 or 30%. And it was also called modified Atkins. And then this was really good for, someone who lifts weights, and is kind of like the ketogenic diet you hear about now, modified ketogenic diet. And that increase in protein, I was still able to maintain a state of ketosis and maintain muscle, maintain strength in the gym. But I really do it from the cognitive. For me, the big benefits were energy flow throughout the day, mood, I think. And I also had like a little bit of anxiety. I think I just kind of grew up a very shy person, and public speaking absolutely terrified me. And I didn't even want to do a PhD because I knew I had to do a public defense. And I remember just that was absolutely terrifying. And so I think it really helped from an anxiety and mood, and allowed me to leverage my potential a little bit better, just through being able to work harder, sustain longer, cognitive efforts over time, get more publications, get more work done, things like that. So I think that's maybe the benefits that may appeal to some of the people, that do it from your side. But there are side effects too that you have to sort of manage along the way.
Yeah. And I think some of the benefits that you're talking about, many women can relate to, not being controlled by our hunger. This is something that I think a lot of women struggle with. And I think when you go from, any other type of, even, more of like a Paleolithic type of diet to more of a ketogenic diet, the amount of fat that you take in is such a wonderful appetite suppressant, and it's so satiating, and really helps. And I think just naturally, at least my observation has been that when women transition to a ketogenic diet, they naturally will drop their caloric intake, because first the density of fat obviously is, 9 kilocalories per gram versus the 4 that we see in protein and carbohydrates, and the 7 in alcohol. But it's very much a satiating diet. We see a natural caloric restriction, which may account for some of that initial rapid weight loss that we see in a lot of women. My big goal is like to get women away from these 1,200 calorie diets, because so many of them have been doing 1,200 calories for decades, which has, we can talk about extended caloric restriction and in our conversation. But I think one of the benefits is that it's easier to calorically restrict on a ketogenic diet because you just feel fuller, right?
Yeah, I think there's definitely truth to that. I think fat and a combination of protein can influence a number of different hormones. And for most people, one thing about the ketogenic diet, for some people, it has to do with their relationship with food. And I think when I started with the ketogenic diet and I was measuring it out and wanted to be eucaloric, the amount of food that was on my plate was not very big. You know what I mean? Because the caloric density is so high.
Right.
So, and when ketogenic food companies came out and were sending you prepackaged ketogenic foods, I know Quest Nutrition did this for a while. And it was like, I was looking at the amount of food I would eat, like 4 or 5, meals or whatever for my caloric intake. And it was just such a small amount of food. Mm-hmm. And you have to get used to that, and your stomach sort of like shrinks over time. And I think that plays into, your meal too. As you stretch your stomach with more food, and you're not, the volume of food that you consume plays a role in how you feel and your satiation too. And for some people, I think they're maybe more sensitive to that. So they, I know, and I think this seems to be more prevalent in females, that sometimes they overeat. They get very into like cooking with ketogenic and making it almost hyper palatable. I always say like the ketogenic diet's good for weight loss because it's hyper satiating and hypo palatable in a way, because it's not, although you can cook meals and make fat bombs and things. And I think my sister did this too. And she actually like gained weight on the ketogenic diet a little bit, as I've communicated with a number, probably only women that have communicated with me, a subset of them that have gained weight on the ketogenic diet. I think because it's easy. I mean, I could sit down with a bag of cashews and do a lot of damage as sort of caloric intake. So, but if I'm eating, just fish, meat, vegetables, my version of the ketogenic diet now is quite high in fiber. And I think that plays a big role. I'm not necessarily a carnivore advocate. I think the carnivore diet is great for some people. I think it can sustain life, but you can survive just off eating meat as you can survive off being a vegan diet, but I don't think it's optimal. I think the optimal diet is an omnivorous diet, higher in protein, higher in fat than sort of the standard American diet, with a liberal amounts of fiber. So I've sort of gravitated to that over the years, and I have blood work to show, at least in my case, that produces favorable changes in biomarkers of cardiometabolic health.
So let's touch on the biomarkers. And my other question to you, as you were talking, I was curious about how the composition of your ketogenic diet. So the sort of classic did you start off more of like the classic 4-to-1 macronutrient split with keto, and then you've maybe moved to increasing your carbohydrates over time? How has your application of the diet changed?
I did. I started with like the truly classic 4-to-1 ketogenic diet. The book was written by John Freeman and Eric Kossoff from Johns Hopkins. And it was tough. I mean, it was like I had like an egg yolk omelet and with butter, and that was kind of like breakfast. And then fat was just tons of olive oil and steak with like butter. But I was actually getting a lot of my calories from a product called Keto Cal. And that was like a 4-to-1 ratio. It was basically just like drinking fat. And at the time, we didn't really know a lot about hydrogenated fats. So it was essentially like casein and hydrogenated fats and like a little bit of sweetener. And it was not, they've changed their formula now. That's like, hydrogenated fats are almost like outlawed in most countries. So that I had a bit of I almost felt like I was lightly sedated. Like once I got into a state of ketosis, like a little bit drunk, a little bit like I was very calm. And I think it made me from being a little bit type A, sort of hyper anxious, to just very calm and almost overly relaxed. But at the same time, I was very productive. And then I started losing some strength. At the time, I was quite bigger at the time, but I was losing some strength. So I probably had some weight to lose, but I was losing some muscle. And I remember distinctly in 2008, the Eric Kossoff published the modified Atkins diet. And I had advised a patient who was doing a bodybuilding contest. His name was Mike Dancer, and he had drug-resistant epilepsy, terminal epilepsy. And the doctors, he had tried every drug on the planet. And I communicated with him and I told him about the ketogenic diet, and he did the ketogenic diet. We didn't talk for about 3 months. And then he communicated with me again and said he had not had a seizure, and he was having multiple seizures per day. So his story became quite popular online. And I think bodybuilding.com like featured him in one of the articles, and he was like, in the newspapers and things like that. And he actually, I incorporated his story in my TEDx talk. So and seeing his response to the ketogenic diet motivated me more, not only to use it, as a lifestyle approach, and that you can kind of use it for sports and powerlifting and whatever, but to also pursue a career path where I was investigating the efficacy and the mechanism of the ketogenic diet for seizures and neurological diseases and even cancer. Later on, I had a student come in and she was very interested in investigating this for cancer. So that became a whole nother PhD dissertation and research publications from that.
And so your modified Atkins is, I typically talk about a 70-20-10. So I typically talk about like a 70% fat, about 20% protein or so. And then the fill is carbohydrates. Is that close to what you shape shifted into or something different?
That's very close. Yeah. And I occasionally, I used to be I used to record everything, but now I'm such a routine oriented person that I know exactly what I eat and can kind of look at a plate and kind of calculate the macros in my head. But I'd use various macro trackers throughout the years, and I always come out to about 65% fat. On some days it could be as high as or low as 50% fat, but generally about 25 to 35% protein. And then the balance of that, being high fiber carbohydrates in the form of salads. We eat a lot of broccoli from the Brassica family, and cauliflower, asparagus, salad greens. And then I do have some fruit, like at night, usually like wild blueberries or something from our property.
That's great. And so speaking of, the Brassica genus, let's talk a little bit about the microbiome, because I think that I've heard a lot on really both sides of the fence around the effects of the ketogenic diet on the diversity of the microbiome. Now, keeping in mind, we don't know, even as a practitioner, I do GI maps all the time, and sometimes I don't know what I'm looking at either, right? So, we don't know everything about the microbiome, at least, but I wanted to speak to maybe the benefits around soluble fibers that we might see in things like broccoli sprouts, cauliflower, etc. So maybe you can walk us through some of the advantages and or disadvantages to the diversity and function of the microbiome with a ketogenic diet.
Yeah, your microbiome eats what you eat, really, and that will dictate the volume of the microbiome and the diversity. So I'll say this, there's a lot that I don't know, although it is an area of research that we do. Small intestinal bacterial overgrowth is a fairly big problem with some people, and a ketogenic diet or just even a low carb diet or intermittent fasting can be very helpful for that. So there's, my kind of feeling is that there's people who can do a carnivore diet, which is completely devoid of fiber and do perfectly fine. And that was kind of surprising to me, because that was my concern with the ketogenic diet initially, is that it was really low in fiber. So strawberries have kind of relatively high fiber, lower. So I remember in the beginning, I would have like 1 or 2 strawberries or something like that. And that would be like the whole fiber for the day. But I was taking a psyllium husk, small amounts of that, and was thinking that this would be important. There's a variety of different fibers that are in ketogenic products now, like chicory root and inulin and acacia. Man, and they do a number on my stomach. I had someone sent me product last night and I ate it, and it just caused like major intestinal bloating, and I didn't get a good sleep. So, and some people do really well with those kinds of fibers. So I don't think, my body personally does not need a lot of fiber, I think, to maintain a healthy microbiome, just based upon feel. And I haven't done extensive analysis of my microbiome, but it's very obvious that some people can do quite well off little or no fiber. And that will undoubtedly decrease the overall diversity of their microbiome, but it might be shifting it in a way that is favorable. And
like away from more opportunistic bacteria and pathogens. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So there's research coming out now that instead of, I do think that soluble and insoluble fiber is important, and having, our ancestors ate one of my as an undergrad, I studied nutrition science and majored in that, and then went on to double major in biology. I went into neuroscience to do my PhD, but I was always interested in nutrition, and even kept up on the literature. And it's very clear that our early ancestors ate a huge amount of fiber, like 100, 200 grams of fiber a day, which is normal for us. But it's very interesting. I think what's very interesting is that humans are incredibly adaptable in the amount of fiber that they can have in their diet and their just diet in general. They can eat completely like fat and protein like the Inuit, or completely vegan like in some populations, and do very well. So I think we're very adaptable. Fermented foods, there's a couple of publications that came out recently that eating fermented foods may actually have a more favorable effect on your microbiome than a similar group that was just eating a diversity of different fibers. So I think that's an important, I think there's research that we need to do there on fermented foods too. In regards to the microbiome, I'm not a microbiome expert, although we are doing research on the microbiome. We've done space analog research on NASA Extreme Environment Mission operations, where we have astronaut poop in our, saying that we have samples from different studies that we did, looking at this and how extreme environments may shift it. And I'm in, correspondence with all the top, researchers. I do have some concerns about the rodent model studies that are looking at this and the translatability of that research. I think what I'll say now, I think fiber is important for the diet. I don't think it's a good idea to completely have a diet that's devoid of fiber, like the trend with the carnivore diet. And I think I'm becoming increasingly interested in the benefits of fermented food incorporated into the diet. So I think there's some favorable shifts in the microbiome from fermented food.
Yeah, that's interesting, because we were talking in the pre-chat, and I was telling you about a lot of times it's my Hashimoto's thyroiditis, my Hashi women, where we might have a therapeutic intervention of a carnivore diet for a short delta. Like, it's not years and years. It might be 3 months. It might be 6 months. And we see measurable improvements in, for example, in terms of the permeability of the gut. And we will see, their thyroid, like the autoantibodies reduce once we redo their thyroid panel again. And so it's interesting. I think carnivore is very interesting as a therapeutic intervention. And of course, there's a lot of case studies, anecdotal case studies where women are reporting, I did carnivore and my Hashimoto's went into remission, or my MS, or my name the autoimmune disorder here, went into remission. So I think it's an interesting construct as an intervention, but with a temporary, with an expiry date on it. And I tend to agree with you with the fiber over the long term, I think is important. But if we have gut dysbiosis, we have opportunistic pathogens that have overtaken the diversity in the microbiome, or, we don't have, those things need to be corrected for before you're eating because then anything you eat is now, if you have that increased intestinal permeability, then you're going to be getting all of these bits of food and viruses and blah, 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 going through
absolutely
from the lumen, from the the gut into the bloodstream and running amok there. So,
So you compromise the tight junctions. And if you're eating a lot of vegetables too, it does kind of set you up for being infected with different pathogens, because you're more likely to get sort of E. coli and other pathogens in vegetables if you're eating a lot of salads relative to meat. So that's, an important consideration, especially if you're traveling abroad and your microbiome, your gut is hit with bugs that it's normally not, used to experiencing, which I have experienced in several occasions where we've traveled to Philippines or Cambodia or Thailand or Borneo, where a couple of times I got the, travelers, scenario where you're your gut is really hit with bugs that it's not familiar with probably, or maybe it might have been bacterial or viral gastroenteritis. And I did blood work immediately when coming home, and my HSCRP, which is something that I measure quite often, it's usually 0.1 or 0.2, or sometimes not even non-detectable, was literally like off the charts. And in the last maybe 7-8 years, we've traveled, and it happened twice kind of on my way home. And I was almost excited to do blood work to see what was going on in my body. And the thing that just was screaming off the charts was my immune system was like hyper activated, like C-reactive protein. I didn't even know it could get that high in me because I'd measured it so many times, and I rarely get sick. So, and that's a really good indication that as soon as you compromise the integrity of the intestinal mucosa and those tight junctions loosen up and allow things to enter circulation, you get systemic inflammation, you get, the chills, and that leads to neuroinflammation. It's not great for your brain and stuff too. So something to consider. Yeah.
So let's talk about measuring ketones. One of the things that I've heard you say before, which I think is a very astute observation, is that the ketogenic diet is the only diet that has a biomarker associated with it, which is the production of ketone bodies or the presence of ketone bodies. Is there a preference that you have in terms of how you measure ketone body production? So there's several different ways. There's blood, there's breath, there's urine, and are there any and maybe there's ones that I haven't mentioned, but are there any advantages of any of these methods over the other, and which ones do you prefer?
Yeah, it depends on why you're using the ketogenic diet, I think, and what your budget is too. The urine strips get like a fairly bad rep, but I think they give you a semi-quantitative indication whether you're in ketosis or not. So, and there's people within the world of neurology and epilepsy that still use this in kids, and they use it quite well in managing and titrating the ketogenic diet from that scenario. So if you're on a limited budget, I think the keto sticks are quite informative to tell you if you're in ketosis or not. And once you have confirmed that you're in a state of ketosis and you want to get more insight into adjusting your diet and maintaining a state of ketosis, or maybe you're testing a ketone supplement or different versions of the ketogenic diet, then a blood ketone meter can be useful. And Abbott Lab, they make the Precision Extra, and I also use the Keto Mojo, and I have a few other devices that I'm tinkering around with, which seem to be pretty good, actually. I won't mention them yet because I'm still testing them. But another method for testing that I actually prefer now is, especially because I think it's very good for being a highly correlative to fat oxidation, is breath ketones. And Readout Health makes an FDA-approved device called the Biosensometer. And I've made thousands of measurements of my blood ketones, beta-hydroxybutyrate, and I've correlated it on a eukaloric diet, which means I'm meeting my caloric needs with my breath acetone. And then it parallels it quite well on different versions of the ketogenic diet, even with exogenous ketones. And then I noticed that if I had any degree of calorie restriction or I fasted, and particularly if I was active, your body is using beta-hydroxybutyrate as a fuel, whereas the fat burning process becomes elevated and would detect my acetone levels as increasingly getting higher, which made sense because I was in a higher state of ketosis. But if your tissues are hungry, then you're facilitating disposal of beta-hydroxybutyrate in the tissues. It's using it as energy. So beta-hydroxybutyrate was not a great indicator of ketosis if you are lean, if you are physically fit, if your body is insulin sensitive, and you have a high metabolic rate. I noticed that people just can't get a high level of blood ketones. I've noticed that, and I'm kind of one of those people. But I did notice my breath acetone was going off the charts. I think by the time I reached 48 hours of fasting, I maxed out the meter at 40. So I didn't even know what it was, but it was just 40, 40, 40. And that's as high as it goes. And I think that's a very good indication of it being in a very high fat oxidation state. Whereas my blood ketones were like 1.5 to 2.5 and staying that even in a prolonged fasted state. But sometimes, when I'm fasting, I could have a ketone level of like 1.2 and my breath ketones will be really high, and they're measured in ACEs. So I think the breath ketone device has many advantages for people who are into intermittent fasting and who want to track their fat oxidation. And you don't have to buy strips, and you can puff into it, hundreds if not thousands of times, and you don't have to tinker with sticking your finger or buying strips. So that's a major advantage. I'm still testing it. It's being used in many different clinical trials right now. So I was a little skeptical in the beginning, but it took me about a year or so and a couple broken devices and things but now the device is very accurate. And I think it's probably the best indicator of measuring your fat oxidation effect. So I'd recommend it for people for that.
And I agree with you. It's less painful too, right? So you can also like for the kids, right? You can also get them to just breathe into it. It's not, you're all in, and especially if you want to take several measurements a day, you at some point you're like squeezing the blood out of your fingers. I would, and maybe you've already answered this. I've given several like glucose tolerance tests for patients. So we give them like a disgusting drink that they have to, or we look at like postprandial glucose if they're wearing a CGM. Yeah, like the glucola example is like 75 grams of glucose. And is there an equivalent to a glucose tolerance test where we might have a ketone tolerance test?
Yeah, that's a good question. I became interested in this because the late Dr. Veach brought it to my attention that athletes will dispose of ketones really quickly in their tissues because athletes who are not even on a ketogenic diet will often enter a state of ketosis. It's called post-exercise ketosis when they deplete their liver glycogen or muscle glycogen when they're exercising. So their bodies are kind of used to using ketones, to producing them, to transporting them across tissues, which is a transporter, and to burning them in the tissues, which involve ketolytic enzymes. So all these things are sort of upregulated in athletes. So if you administer an exogenous ketogenic formula, whether it's an ester or salt, it'll clear from the blood faster. So it'll spike up and then clear from the blood faster, similar to giving glucose to an athlete that's insulin sensitive. So whereas if you have a couch potato subject who's just never exercises and maybe not metabolically fit, the pharmacokinetic curve of that will be shifted to the right. So the area under the curve will be much larger, and similar to administering glucose to a type 2 diabetic, it'll stay elevated for a long time. So you could conceivably do a ketone tolerance test and administer ketogenic agents in different forms and different levels and see how fast they how fast your body disposes of them and clears them from the blood. And that could be a way to assess being keto adapted. Over time, the more we make ketones, transport them, and burn them as fuel, the more adept our body becomes at doing that. And I think that becomes a major factor in some people quickly adapting to the ketogenic diet and other people going down the spiral of a keto flu. Like I never really had the keto flu, but some people get hit pretty hard by it. And I think that could be mitigated in part with exogenous ketones. The bottleneck seems to be the various enzymes that are associated with ketogenesis in the liver. So if you go on a low carb diet, your insulin and glucose go down. And if your body does not ramp up ketone production in the liver, and there's quite a few enzymes and they're regulated through a diverse set of pathways. And many of those pathways can be completely deficient or very impaired in some people. And we can have all sorts of SNPs that can, and I'm actually reading into this now, it's very fascinating literature. So some people can quickly, robustly make ketones in the liver and other people not so much. And I think that plays a big role in keto flu and also the glucose withdrawal that the brain goes through, I think, when we enter a ketogenic state or if we fast. And some people, there's certain enzymes that people don't make, and they can actually have a seizure or go and faint and go into a coma in a fasted state because they lack certain production of various ketogenesis enzymes.
So let's talk about exogenous ketones, because this is, and I'll call myself out here. This is something I know that you've spent a lot of time researching. And when I first was introduced to the ketogenic diet, and maybe it was just because of the nature of who was approaching me around, promoting, their ketogenic product. It was all their ketone product. There was always a sort of in the back of my head, there was always like a hard eye roll, like, okay, this is like an MLM, downstream. I was going to be part of their, downline or whatever they call it. And they always used your name, by the way. It's like, oh, he helped formulate this product. But yeah. So I always sort of had this resistance to using exogenous ketones. I always was a bit of a hard ass. And I would say, you need to be able to produce endogenously. You first have to get at least 0.5 millimolar, ideally to 1 millimolar of ketones measurable. And then we can talk about exogenous ketone supplementation. I've since changed my mind on that, especially when it comes to, at least in my practice, I saw a lot of patients with concussions. And so we know that there's this impaired glucose uptake in the brain when the brain is inflamed from, a car accident, or I would see a lot of, car accidents and a lot of soccer injuries, et cetera. So let's maybe speak about some of the benefits of exogenous ketone supplementation, some of the therapeutic uses of them. I'd love for you to talk about TBIs and concussions if you feel so inclined, because I don't know why this is almost all of my concussive patients. They were like soccer players, which you can understand. They go up for a header or something. But then it was female lawyers. It was like female lawyers who were working themselves to the bone and, maybe lost orientation, fell down and hit their head from exhaustion. And then I had my soccer cohort. So talk a little bit about, and it doesn't have to just be TBIs. Of course, there's a lot of application for exogenous ketones. We can get into some of those, including exercise and stuff, but talk about some of the benefits of them and their therapeutic uses.
Yeah, real quickly, I was pretty resistant to studying exogenous ketones, and I wanted to study the ketogenic diet, but the Office of Navy Research was not very supportive of using a high-fat ketogenic diet in the military due to operational constraints. So, you have a group of guys, Navy SEALs, going into a mission. You got to start the diet. It takes a while to get into a state of ketosis. And
adapt to it. The adaptability is also... Yeah.
And adapt to it. Yeah. So, the question was presented to me that, well, we're not really willing to fund that, but if you could develop, test and show a ketogenic diet in a pill, then, and that got me on, looking into this. And then I connected with a couple investigators, Dr. Richard Veach was one, and Henry Brunengraber. So there's a kind of a long story there. But what really surprised me is that when I was able to get, I tested a number of different agents that didn't work. And I was like, you need to adapt to a ketogenic diet. You need to, and some of the early studies with seizures for the type of seizure I was studying show that if you fasted the rats, then it was super neuroprotective. And I was convinced that the body needed to go through this adaptation phase. You change metabolic physiology, and then the brain sort of invites ketones to, restore. And we didn't know at the time, we still don't know how ketones are anti-seizure, but, we got a particular agent that we administered to rats 30 minutes, and they were on a high carbohydrate diet, and we put them in the chamber, and we saw a remarkable increase in the latency to seizure and neuroprotection. And, we did the next one and the next one, and it was working every time. And I realized there was something to this, and it depended upon the formulation, and there was a lot of nuance that needed to be sort of understood and acknowledged, and that has been a big part of the research that we've done over the years. So there's no doubt in my mind that exogenous ketones, it doesn't have to be one or the other. So the way I when I present at the American Epilepsy Society or the NIH at a recent workshop, there are people that are unwilling or unable to do the ketogenic diet for therapeutic purposes, or maybe even as a lifestyle. And in that case, exogenous ketones could be a good option for that. But I think I kind of pitch it as a way to further augment the therapeutic efficacy of the ketogenic diet when it comes to neurological diseases, cognitive function, even lowering blood glucose, inflammation, anti-catabolic effects, mood. I was talking with an organization last night on bipolar, and their son has bipolar and was put on a ketogenic diet, and it was the only thing that worked for them, but it was hard for him to stay on the ketogenic diet. And then they acquired exogenous ketones and gave it to him, and it worked remarkably well. And this is very interesting to hear, because my wife, as you may know, Chilla, when we were gavaging the animals for another study and giving them exogenous ketones, she noticed that they were just easier to handle. Their fear response was attenuated. So we ended up doing a series of studies showing that exogenous ketones lower anxiety and actually decrease fear response and actually have a favorable behavioral effect in the animals. And
you reported that yourself as well. You said that you used to be very anxious and not wanted to defend your thesis, and you sort of felt much calmer. Yeah. So we can see that at least in an N of 1 in humans as well.
Yeah. I think it's important to acknowledge, though, that when you fast or when you do a ketogenic diet, actually when you do a ketogenic diet, in some people, it could increase seizures initially. So there's this period that you go through because it's a stress to the body. Right. Your body, it'll augment the sympathetic nervous system. Cortisol will go up, glucagon goes up, insulin goes down. So it's a stress response. So that's why the initiation of the ketogenic diet for epilepsy really needs to be done by a team. And I think more so for if we're going to use it for bipolar or different psychiatric diseases, we need to really have a team of people treating the person. But once we go through that adaptation, and actually that's where exogenous ketones can come into play. I always thought there's something called status epilepticus, where patients could be in a continuous seizure for a period of time, and you can't really feed them a diet. But in that case, tube feeding exogenous ketones or giving them intravenously could be very important in that scenario. But there are many different benefits that were unexpected in our research efforts over the years, where we were hyper focused on seizures, but we acknowledge, and we know now, even in the seizure world, that it's preventing seizures because it's making the brain work better. So you're giving an alternative energy substrate, you're increasing the levels of GABA relative to glutamate. And we know GABA is sort of a brain stabilizing, neuroprotective, calming hormone, whereas many neurodegenerative diseases are pathophysiologically linked to excess glutamate, which causes an increase in, excitotoxicity, right? So, and it's kind of interesting. We make GABA from glutamate through an enzyme called glutamic acid decarboxylase. So there's two enzymes, GAD 65 and 67, and they are increased with the ketogenic diet. And they're also increased independent of the ketogenic diet, but with exogenous ketones. And we've published that in a model of Angelman syndrome, which we've shown in an animal model of Angelman syndrome is very responsive. And then we moved that to a clinical trial, which is ongoing now. It might be finished up, and we should be publishing that pretty soon. So a lot of interesting, I think mechanistically, the ketogenic diet works, and it's multifaceted, and it works in a variety of different ways, which seem to be working synergistically. And many of those ways are independent of any known anti-epileptic drug or any other drug that we know of. And I think that's why it works when drugs fail. So when kids, it's still not the first line of therapy. So kids have to fail not only one anti-seizure drug, but multiple anti-seizure drugs have to fail before they put their hands up and then put the kid on the ketogenic diet. And in that case, when all drugs fail, 2/3 of the patients who are put on a ketogenic diet respond favorably, and a subset of them are cured, which means they are hyper responders and they never get seizures again. So, you have a therapy that's so effective, even when drugs fail, you would think it would be a first line of therapy. But the neurologists, the epileptologists, they don't really have a registered dietitian. They don't have a team of people that can help in that way. And you have to change like the culture of the family too, and clear out all the foods. It becomes very difficult to implement. So that's
hundreds of different behaviors. Like you're changing the way you prepare your food, where you shop, like how you prepare the food,
Absolutely. And I think the same could be for the common lifestyle use for using the ketogenic diet for weight loss or things like that. If someone is dead set on using it for weight loss and you have a woman using it for weight loss, but the guy is like eating chips and Pop-Tarts and stuff every night, it's going to be hard. I know even I'm pretty disciplined. And if I have like trigger foods at home, even like a bowl of fruit, it becomes difficult for me, and I have pretty good discipline to sustain, a ketogenic diet. You have to purge the house of foods. And I think, but at the same time, I eat like a small amount of dark chocolate every night. I think if you restrict too much, then you become, it can trigger behaviors that can be counterproductive. So I think it's good to let yourself, have a small amount. But for things like dark chocolate, it's almost like, you eat a small piece of it and that's enough. You know what I mean? It's like,
oh, you can't have a whole bar of dark chocolate, especially if it's 85 or 90%.
Yeah. It's almost like you don't want to. Yeah. So.
Yeah, you can't. And it's interesting that you say that because in my family, and this is, hopefully child services is not going to be called, but, in my family, they gave us wine when we were little. Mm-hmm. And, my children have, they're 10 and 8, and they're like, what do you, I don't have wine that often, but when, maybe it's Thanksgiving or it's Christmas or something, I'll have a glass. And what is that, mommy? And it's like, well, try it, so that it's not this, to your point around not overly restricting. What I saw growing up was when, teenagers, you were of age and you could start getting access to alcohol, they just went crazy. Yeah. They went crazy. And it wasn't that big of a draw for me because I was like, well, I've had this with my grandparents for 10 years. Like, who cares?
Yeah. Well, just on that theme, like for me, red wine, it's kind of self-limiting because I have a glass and once I feel it, that's when I stop. But if I drink more, then I get sleepy and tired. So I would not want to drink more of that. And, everybody's kind of different. I mean, for some people, it may trigger the more you feel it, the more you want to drink it. But you have to, it's almost like being addicted to alcohol. We are addicted to sugar in some ways. It's a little bit different response, but there's a lot of overlap on the brain chemistry that's affected with addictive, personalities. And I think you need to strategize if you want to implement a ketogenic diet or just a low carb diet. It really results in what's on your grocery list. Like you have to, and what's in your cupboards, mm-hmm. You are going to eat whatever's in your house, and you have to acknowledge that you can't go on a diet of certain foods and have other foods that are not part of that diet in your house. Yeah. So, this is what I learn a lot from the epilepsy world. Like, I hear a lot of stories from registered dietitians and a lot of parents that, kids will find, especially once they reach into adolescence, they will get around eating the ketogenic diet. It becomes very hard to implement in adolescence.
And they don't have the frontal lobe yet, right? They don't have that inhibitory control yet that's coming from, so they see something, they're like, oh, sugar, yum. Let me just, So I agree with that. Speak to some of the, when we're taking exogenous ketones, I'd love for you to talk to the effects that it has potentially on glucose and insulin and some of the metabolic effects that exogenous ketone supplementation can have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's one of the things that we saw in our pharmacokinetic studies where we administer the exogenous ketones and then we measure ketones, blood ketones, beta hydroxybutyrate, acetoacetate, and acetone and then glucose over time, is that we consistently saw a decrease in blood glucose to the point where it was very profound, like more than you would get from like metformin or something like that. So I attributed that to when we endogenously produce ketones, we regulate that production in our blood in a variety of different ways. One way is we keep through ketone in our urine, and ketonuria it's called. And then as ketones get elevated in the blood, that can stimulate the pancreas to release a little bit of insulin, and then the insulin decreases. It doesn't shut it off, kind of like a rheostat, right? It decreases beta oxidation of fats in the liver, and that accelerated beta oxidation of fats is actually what accumulates the acetyl-CoA to make acetoacetate and beta hydroxybutyrate. Mm-hmm. So it decreases, ketone production, and it's a very fine-tuned mechanism. And with exogenous ketones, it kind of like, you wonder what's going on there. And my thinking was that, it's just pulsing insulin, and then the insulin is, triggering glucose disposal. And that happens with a very large dose of a ketone ester. But it does not happen with, for example, MCTs or ketone salts. So the lowering of blood glucose must be due to a different mechanism. So the potential mechanisms, and I think could be highly therapeutic, and it's important to talk about, and it's really important to do more research. And now I see on clinicaltrials.gov, there's quite a few registered clinical trials looking at this. But I almost feel like I was like the first one to see this, but we weren't really studying it to look at glucose regulation. We were studying it to look at seizures, but it was just like data that was very interesting to us. And I've measured my insulin in response to high doses of ketone ester, and I do see it go up, but only when you get past about 2 to 2.5 millimolar delta. So and that's a pretty large, that's almost hard to do with a ketone salt, but you can do it with a ketone ester. So we see that independent of an elevation of insulin. So this is very important because that's assuming or an indication that it's enhancing insulin sensitivity, which is a really good thing. It's also indicative of decreasing hepatic glucose output, and that could be due to decreasing gluconeogenesis or decreasing maybe glycogenolysis. Right. So a lot of, glucose that we're getting in circulation is from gluconeogenesis, but a lot of it's from your liver has glycogen and it's breaking, it's synthesizing it and breaking it down, and it's interfering with that process in some way. The only way we're going to really figure it out is to do like metabolomics on the liver. So I'm in contact with some people, and I think I want to get to the bottom of this and figure out what's going on. I think it has significant implications for managing type 2 diabetes with exogenous ketones.
Mm-hmm. Even my understanding of, the metabolic management of cancer is very limited, but I would assume that in cancers that are feeding off of glucose, at least initially, if we're able to attenuate the amount of glucose that's available, then you're able to disrupt their energy source as well.
I didn't know we were going to, you want to go down the cancer road, but I could talk about that for a while, but that actually is why I became so interested in this idea of being able to lower blood glucose without increasing insulin, and the ability to do that, and creating an engineered metabolic therapy that could change different metabolites and actually put the body into a state where you're restricting fuel sources to the cancer and creating a hormonal scenario where you have insulin suppression, elevated ketones, limited amount of glucose, and in some cases, certain amino acids, and you are suppressing, the mTOR pathway and IGF-1 and other things that could marginalize, the growth of cancer. So I think I view exogenous ketones as a tool to achieve what's called a low glucose ketone index, which is the measurement of glucose over ketones in the millimolar concentration. Mm-hmm. And if you are, for example, if I fast for 72 hours, I can get my ketones to about 3, and my glucose gets down to about 3. So that's a glucose ketone index of 1. And you can achieve that on a high carbohydrate diet within 30 minutes with an exogenous ketone ester, and is that the same state? No, but you are rapidly producing a physiological state that I think over time, if that's sustained over time, will have favorable effects on the metabolic management of cancer for certain cancers, for sure. And will have an anti-seizure effect.
You mentioned esters and salts. Maybe let's talk about the difference between them. What an exogenous ketone is in the form of ketone salts, and then I'd love to talk about some of the different forms of salts, and then we can talk about esters as well.
Yeah, the first agents that we tested were ketone esters, and they're synthesized from a variety of sources. What we found in our studies early on was that a ketone ester that, when ingested, elevated both beta-hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate in a 1-to-1 ratio. That particular ketone ester gave us the highest level of neuroprotection. Whereas when we used a beta-hydroxybutyrate monoester, then that did not have, that was the first thing that we tested. It didn't have any anti-seizure effects. So I thought maybe we're going to throw this idea out the window, but I talked to more basic science researchers and they said, well, the data seems to indicate that you need to elevate acetoacetate and acetone. So then that led me to this ketone ester that elevates acetoacetate and beta-hydroxybutyrate. And then that was remarkably effective. And we published a number of publications on that. So then I had this idea. I started thinking about, well, can't you make a ketone salt? And I saw sodium beta-hydroxybutyrate was what we used in our cell cultures. So we would buy small amounts from Sigma, and then we would, mix it up, and then we would grow the cells inside the cells. So I was like, why can't I just take sodium beta-hydroxybutyrate? And I was like, why can't you just take other monovalent and divalent cations and combine it with beta-hydroxybutyrate. So I was like talking with chemists and I was like, yeah, we should be able to do that. And we were looking at how come nobody's doing this? So we started tinkering around and we started making, potassium beta-hydroxybutyrate. And then it was like, well, why don't we try calcium and magnesium? So we started making these salts. And then that's sort of like the back history of how we created, that's all, the whole market of ketone salts was sort of this idea of, the fear in the past was that you'll have a sodium overload. To get into ketosis, you had to take massive amounts of sodium beta-hydroxybutyrate. And there's been persistently this fear of salt, right?
Well, that's so another, along with estrogen and cholesterol. I mean, these are the demonized 3, but yes, go on.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So the first idea I had was like, I was looking at sodium and I looked at the studies on sodium because I did have a fear of sodium even at the time. And then I looked at studies that gave like sodium potassium and there was no elevation in blood pressure and some other things. I was like, why don't we just create, a balanced sodium potassium salt? Then that should solve the problem. And potassium was a little bit problematic for different reasons, but it could stop your heart if you take too much of it. That was one reason. But we started tinkering with like calcium, magnesium, and creating other ketone salts. And long story short, it became a couple, patents, and companies picked it up. Companies that I did not pick, that the university picked as licensing partners. And then, there was a whole market formed and MLM companies and other companies out there selling ketone salts. So I really believe that if you formulate the ketone electrolytes in a certain way, and after tinkering with it quite a bit and looking at purity, potency, and most importantly, tolerability, gut tolerability is super important. We settled upon an electrolyte formulation that's kind of similar to like like Gatorade. Actually, it's very similar to the supplement LMNT or Element that Rob
that's Rob's.
Yeah. And I love that. I kind of use it every day.
I'm drinking it right now, actually. I'm drinking the grapefruit. Yeah. Love his stuff. Yeah.
I really love I think it's electrolytes are super important. And we just happen to come on, and maybe not by accident, because it is the most tolerable. An electrolyte, a balanced electrolyte formulation that's very similar to Element, but the electrolytes are bound to ketones. So when you're consuming it, you're getting an LMNT or Element type electrolyte formulation, but you're also delivering ketones at the same time. So that's the formulation that we tinkered with, and we did quite a bit of research, not only on ketone esters, but also these ketone salts, and they seem to be, you get favorable effects when you combine it with MCT. Not everybody can tolerate MCT, so that becomes, a problem for some people, but not all. But if you have, the salts are pretty potent in and of themselves, but in certain scenarios, they work better if you combine the salts with MCT. And there's different, products out there that you can just get pure MCT.
And the MCT intolerance is because of the lauric acid or because of the saturated fat metabolism?
I've looked into that, and there's no universal sort of consensus as to why we have an intolerance to certain medium chain triglycerides. But octanoic acid and decanoic acid, they also go by the name of capric and caprylic acid, can be irritable to the small intestine for some people, and they are to everybody, and under certain combinations, but they can also be sort of have favorable effects so it's kind of like a dose thing. The triglyceride, I don't know. I'm trying to look to find an answer to make MCTs more palatable, so you can increase. It's remarkable because rats have such a robust fat metabolism. If you gavage, which is kind of like tube feeding a rat MCT, you can get ketone levels up equivalent to a ketone ester, which is really, you can't get 5-6 millimolars of beta hydroxybutyrate in a human by administering MCT, but you can in rodents because their liver have really high rates of fat oxidation when you deliver the MCT. But it would be nice to figure out a way where you could do that with MCT in humans. And that would be like the poor man's ketone ester, right? Mm-hmm, because ketone, MCT, they're not really flavored, but a ketone ester, no matter, there's no way around it. You can't really flavor it in a way. But what you can do is actually put the molecule that we're working with, we put it in capsules. And the next study, because it's so potent, you just take a couple capsules and you could a very high. I put it in capsules and took 8 to 10 capsules and blew into my biosense meter, and it pinned it to 40 for like the rest of the day. So, it's a super potent molecule. And then, the liquid formulations that you drink, all the ketone esters on the market, they're expensive. And I think
they're horrible tasting as well.
Yeah.
They also taste like, I don't know, they taste like rat poison. I can't, anyway. Yeah, I interrupted you.
Well, no, you did. I think that's a good point. And we sent some to some chemists and they did a mass spec on it, and it had a lot of other stuff in there that shouldn't have been in there. So that was unidentifiable. We couldn't match it up to anything like on the spectrum. So, whereas ketone salts are so simple, right? You just have beta hydroxybutyrate, and then you have a monovalent or divalent cation, a fancy term for sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium. Mm-hmm. I mean, you can also do like lithium, like we have a lithium beta hydroxybutyrate, which is another, it makes it more stable, or lithium acetoacetate. So you can make these salts, and you can engineer them and make it so they replenish your electrolytes and that they taste good. And then you can mix them in with food if you want. And they're very versatile and they're very stable. The shelf life is very, very long, and they don't have to be liquid. They can be in a powder form. So I'm in favor, we probably publish more on ketone esters. So you would think that I would be biased towards ketone esters because most of our publications are ketone esters, but I see the value and the utility. And now you can get purity, potency, and if you do the electrolyte combination right, you can have very high tolerability of these. And I think they're safe. I do think they're very safe. I mean, certain companies, they report selling something like 30 or 40 million doses, and like there's no adverse events really, like on the FDA website, which, something like Red Bull, you have tons of events. So these things are very safe. And it was like a big consumer experiment, I guess, because they were like sort of new entities. These molecules that really did not exist before. Mm-hmm. And they got brought to market very fast. And I was like, well, we'll see what happens. But I was taking them myself, and I knew they had therapeutic benefits. And I knew there was people out there that wanted to use them for managing different chronic disorders. And I think that was part of the motivation of creating, ketone salt products too.
So I know that there's different, when we talk about ketone salts, there's different enantiomers where we have, we have the D and the L. I'd love for you to actually explain what that is, and then why that's important when you're, if you're measuring your ketones on a Keto Mojo or whatever medium, why that's important, and then what would be the optimal level that we should be striving for with these salts when we're taking our measurements.
Yeah, it's really important to know that the commercially available technology that measures blood ketones has an enzymatic assay on the little strip that measures D beta hydroxybutyrate. So your body makes primarily D beta hydroxybutyrate in the liver, but it also makes L beta hydroxybutyrate, but in much smaller quantities. We have an enzyme called a racemase enzyme. So the D and L beta hydroxybutyrate are what we call enantiomers. So they are mirror images, like your hands, to one another, right? D beta hydroxybutyrate seems to have a favorable effect from an energetic point of view, whereas L beta hydroxybutyrate, for reasons we don't really know, seems to elicit important signaling effects and then sticks around in the tissues a bit longer. So it is found in nature. If someone says, L beta hydroxy is not found, we know there's a racemase. It's just made in much smaller quantities. So on the market right now, commercially available, you can buy purely D beta hydroxybutyrate, or you can buy DL, which is the racemic form. We did our research, and the first thing that we studied actually was the D beta hydroxybutyrate, and it did not have anti-seizure effects, but it was just stimulating beta hydroxybutyrate and elevating that in the blood, not the acetoacetate at the same time. So the molecule was R1,3-butanediol beta hydroxybutyrate, R beta hydroxybutyrate. So it was primarily just elevating the D form, beta hydroxybutyrate. So then the next molecule we tested was racemic 1,3-butanediol, which is this dialcohol, and that breaks down to racemic beta hydroxybutyrate and also releases the acetoacetate, in a 1-to-1 combination. So when you measure it, if the beta hydroxybutyrate in this case is 2 millimolar, the total beta hydroxybutyrate in the blood from this particular ketone ester would be 4. Half of it would be L, half of it would be D. There's a number of products on the market that claim they are superior because they are purely the D form and it's the natural form. But like I said, we do make small amounts of L. I think
is that because of the skeletal is that because of the uptake from the muscle? Why would that claim be made?
Why would D be better?
Yeah.
So from a energetic point of view, from a bioenergetic point of view, D beta hydroxybutyrate may have a favorable sort of energetic potency by oxidizing Q and stimulating mitochondrial ATP production in a way that sort of generates a higher redox state, a more reduced state to generate more ATP. Whereas that's for the D beta hydroxybutyrate, and acetoacetate is sort of like an oxidized form of the ketone. So this was my understanding going into research that, and I think it was biased by, I'm not going to name any names or products or anything like that. It was kind of biased by existing patents and existing research in the field, and which was, done in a way that was pretty good science. But on the other hand, I connected with a researcher who was equally esteemed in the field and was, kind of convinced me that if you deliver ketones with a 1-to-1 ratio of acetoacetate and beta hydroxybutyrate, that would be a balanced redox scenario in the blood. And then that could have potentially favor. Whereas if you're just delivering beta hydroxybutyrate in the D form, that creates a shift in the redox that sort of sends your liver off balance in a way. And so it became an interesting discussion and an interesting chain of emails back and forth. Long story short, what we found is that the racemic beta hydroxybutyrate formulations, whether that be salts or esters, seem to be producing favorable effects, not only in neuroprotection, but also anti-cancer effects. And what we know is that if you consume racemic beta hydroxybutyrate, the D beta hydroxybutyrate gets burnt and used as energy pretty fast. And then the L beta hydroxybutyrate tends to stick around in the blood and the tissues longer. And then that gives the potential for the L beta hydroxybutyrate to confer favorable signaling effects in that particular tissue because it's not being burned as fuel as fast. So, there's a beta hydroxybutyrate receptor, there's epigenetic pathways. We published a paper with colleagues in Nature Medicine on the NLRP3 inflammasome, and come to find out that L-beta hydroxybutyrate also suppresses that inflammasome. And when we consume ketone product with D, that gets burned fast in the cells, but the L sticks around longer and has a greater suppressive effect, on that inflammatory pathway. So the way I view it is that you have a favorable effect, that racemic is optimal because you're delivering, a molecule that may be favorably energetic. At the same time, you're delivering a form of beta hydroxybutyrate that has a favorable signaling effect, in that simply because it sticks around longer and is able to activate a variety of signaling pathways, and the body doesn't, it burns it at a much slower rate. So, and then the majority of research really is done on this, and that's that sort of influences my decision based upon, the research that we did. And it seems to have a glucose lowering effect. So the racemic has a greater glucose lowering effect. So I feel that has greater utility for cancer.
So I want to ask you what your favorite, if you're, I don't know if you're able to mention products in terms of which are your favorite products, but I have found personally, I like to work out fasted in the morning. That's when I can, before the kids are up, that's when I get my workout in, and I like to do it. I don't always do this. It's usually on leg day. So I'd like to take a shot of espresso and then have some ketones that I start taking before the workout. So maybe 10, 15 minutes. And then I go down and I'm drinking it intermittently in between my sets. And, Chilla and I have an affinity for Wonder Woman. And I was saying to her, when I do that, I feel like Wonder Woman, I could lift the truck in the final scene in Wonder Woman, fighting Ares. Mm-hmm. So I guess I have two questions for you. One is, favorite exogenous ketone supplementations. If you have products, if you can, or if you have anywhere that we can kind of go to find out more. And the second one is, and you were kind of alluding to it before when we were talking about MCT, but are there, are there stacks, for lack of a better word, are there combinations of supplementation with ketones that can augment in a favorable way, either performance in the gym or mental performance and focus? those would be my sort of my two-part question for you.
Yeah. Good question. Well, I'll tell you what I personally do. So, Chilla was, when people ask us what form of ketones we use, there was really not a whole lot of things on the market. We think we had issues with purity, with potency, and tolerability of the existing products that were on the market. So it's like, why doesn't she kind of take this project and develop something that I personally use? So we had a variety of things and we would mix things together. And over years of literally testing things and publishing quite a bit of research on the formulations, we developed, a ketone product. Although, it's 100% of her work doing that. And that's the product that I use. And it's sold under the name Audacious Nutrition and it's sold as Keto Start and under the company Audacious Nutrition. It's kind of a cool name she came up with. Mm-hmm. So, how I use it, I take about a third of a packet first thing in the morning, and then I add creatine monohydrate to it. And I drink a big glass of water, and then I mix that up. And I take that and maybe occasionally amino acids, but usually just Keto Start, just a third of a packet with like 3 grams of creatine. And I down that, and then I brew my coffee and everything. And to the coffee, I add a product called Keto Brains, and it has MCT in it. And it's got theanine, and it's got alpha GPC and, MCT. So
is that brains with a Z?
Keto Brains with a Z. It's a product that I'm really favor. I've been using it for quite some time, and it's really good because it balances the caffeine with the theanine together. Really creates like a very smooth energy flow. Yeah. But I use the Keto Start product first thing, the Keto Start Plus, because it has some caffeine in it with water, and it's like a nootropic. Like I'm just kind of ready to go. I'm not like a super morning person, but as soon as that hits, I'm ready to go. I go outside, get some sun, let the cows out, let the dogs out, feed the dogs and everything. And I make my French press espresso, but let that sit for a while, and then come in and have coffee with my Keto Brains, and I either get to work, depending on if it's an intermittent fasting day, or I start cooking and we have breakfast together. The main thing about intermittent fasting that I don't like is that we do like to eat together twice a day in the morning, and then at night. And on the days I intermittent fast and don't eat until the afternoon, I miss that morning togetherness that we have. So, but each night we usually, we have dinner, and then we walk the dogs and do that. But so I have a third of the pack of the Keto Start in the morning, and then in the afternoon, that's when I take the other 2/3 of the pack. And sometimes I'll use 2 packs a day, but really just like 1 pack a day. So I don't use a ton of it. I use it sort of sparingly. It's pretty potent stuff. So the Keto Start has a higher concentration than any, product on the market. So 1 packet per day is plenty enough for me. But it depends, if you're managing a chronic disorder, or you're trying to lose weight, or you're trying to, optimally get into a certain state of ketosis, you may want to titrate dosage depending on, what you want to use it for.
Yeah. And Chilla was generous enough to send me a few of them when they came out. And I messaged her afterwards. I was like, this is a fantastic product. I just hit all my PRs on my leg day. I was like upping my squat and my debt. Like it was a great lift. And so I really like using that. I usually only do it on leg day, which is like twice a week. So I'll do that with my coffee. Okay. So there's so many questions that I've prepared. I know that we're not going to have time to get to all of them. I do want to, I want to talk to you about cholesterol and exercise and all that, but I do want to just, if we can, in the time that I have with you, speak a little bit about the ketogenic diet and women. And we've been kind of, dancing around it a little bit, but specifically around thyroid health. This is one thing that I've seen, I've actually seen both. I've seen, an improvement in thyroid function, and then I have certain thoughts about why this may be happening, but in some individuals, we do see a worsening and attenuation of thyroid function, and of course all the metabolic consequences that follow that. So what have been your observations in someone implementing a ketogenic diet and thyroid function?
Well, I think female physiology is hyper reactive to perturbations in physiology. So if that could be a reduction in blood glucose or a reduction in insulin. And I think female physiology and hormonal balance can be offset by a reduction in insulin. And insulin is involved in thyroid. It is involved in the iodo-deiodinase enzyme, I think it's called, from the conversion of T4 to T3 and then reverse T3. So suppressing insulin, which is what the ketogenic diet does, because that's actually how we make ketones. We suppress the hormone insulin, and then beta oxidation of fats contributes to ketone production in the liver. Under eucaloric conditions with higher protein, I do not think this is an issue, based upon communicating with hundreds of women like over the years. In the context of a calorie restriction, or in the context of a lower protein keto, and I consider 20% kind of low protein, whereas I think women, if they're especially if they're on a calorie deficit,
yep.
And they're on a ketogenic diet, I think they need to bump the protein even up to like 40. And in that case, the amino acids may provide enough of an insulin stimulation to prevent the level of insulin suppression that would be associated with reverse T3, or reduction in that active T3. So I've communicated with some people and gave them that recommendation. They're like, well, yeah, you were right. Look, my hormones are back to normal. So it seems to be, if you're going low carb, if you're going keto, it seems to be about the protein. Like keto, calorie restricted, low protein leads to a suppression of thyroid. And also, you tend to get a scenario where, like, if a woman's starting the ketogenic diet, she simultaneously starts doing more cardio, and they start, and they do a greater caloric deficit on top of more cardio. So you have this synergy of suppressing the hormone.
She starts fasting.
Yeah. So that's a recipe for, I would, even if you're going, say, if you're competing in fitness or something, to do it in increments, right? Like to, do a low carb diet and then transition to keto, and then, keep calories kind of normal, and then titrate it as you go. And people lose weight for different reasons, maybe if they need to get back to the normal weight, but if they're trying to get into like contest shape, or like for, the beach or something like that, to not do, the more extreme it is, the more likely it is that you're going to shut down your metabolism and your thyroid. Whereas keep protein high, don't restrict too much, don't overdo it on the cardio. I know some people go crazy with the cardio, but I've seen that's probably one of the biggest variables. Like, everything could be kept normal, and if you overdo it on the cardio, thyroid seems to be very responsive in a negative way to cardio. It's almost like the body's adaptation to preserve it. It's like I feel like I can keep my calories completely the same, and I could go put my thyroid where I want it based upon my level of cardio. So I'm a big advocate of keeping cardio as minimal as possible and lifting weights, doing strength and resistance training, and really stimulating the muscle, because that's your metabolic engine, that's your glucose disposal organ, that you have. And for women, it's even more important, and I'm sure this, for bone density. Bone density is really a consequence of strong muscles. Strong muscles will create the resistance and the tension on the bone that stimulates the reuptake of phosphorus and calcium from it and builds that bone density. So super important, probably even more for women than for men, to do that resistance training 3 times a week or more. Heavy weights too. deadlift, squats, stuff like that.
Yes. And this has really been in line with what I've observed as well. And I mentioned this at the top of our discussion, that I have so many women who will come to me interested in the ketogenic diet, who've been living on this 1,200 calorie diet for decades. And then all they do is they'll make the macronutrient adjustments, but they will keep the same caloric intake. So of course, when you're as a woman, your body's preparing for famine. When you're eating only 1,200 calories, basal metabolic rate tanks. Your exercise output is going to decrease. Your digestion slows, so your body can like literally take every morsel that it can, every piece of energy that it can from the food that you are ingesting. And then to your point, it's, I see women doing 4 or 5 cardio set, and like, not just like a zone 1, or it's not a walk or, a zone 2 training. These are like Peloton heart rates at 190, no shade to Peloton users, but or any type of high intensity, 5 times a week for 40 minutes where they just feel like they're dying on the bike or on whatever. And I like that you mentioned 40%. That's actually the exact protein amount that I typically. So I like this therapeutic intervention of a 70-20-10 for about one cycle. A woman's if she's in her menstrual years, we do it for about 28 days or however long her menstrual cycle is. And then from there, we alternate weeks based on where she is in her cycle, bleed week, pre-ovulatory, luteal phase, and we change the macronutrient composition. So we'll go from a ketogenic, like the profile I just mentioned, to maybe a 40-40-20. So it's like 40% fat, 40% protein, and then, the fill is carbohydrates. And then that also, I love what you're saying, because I think women in general, they need higher carbs. I think this applies to men too, because I've worked more with women, but I have seen in men that have been, the 4-to-1, like the classic, like they don't have, or they're carnivore, they have no carbohydrates, and then they fail those glucose tolerance tests. Because their body's like, what is this? I haven't seen this in years. I haven't seen this substrate. I don't know what this is. So you have this hyperinsulinemic, glycemia, which can be improved. Like you give them some carbs, then their carbohydrate, their uptake improves. But I think for women, we just need a base. We need a base higher in terms of our carbohydrate intake. And I would also say the fasting as well. I can't tell you how many women are like, I fast for 20 hours. And there's nothing wrong with that. But here and there, like the name is intermittent fasting. It's not every day 20-hour fasts. Like I think that's also really
to do it every day. So people ask me, do you do carnivore? I was like, well, maybe I'll have a day or two of carnivore, but to do it every day, day in and day out, it's like carnivore, no carnivore. It's like on or off. Like they're kind of like, some days I just get busy and maybe I just have some steak and eggs and that's it. Yeah. But I really love what you said about, and I think it's extremely needed with women's approach to nutrition. And I've seen it, I think in Chile too, that our nutritional needs change with our hormonal fluctuations with the cycle. And I think, and maybe if that's the program that you have, and I know you coach women, I think that's extremely valuable service that needs to, because I don't think it's wise for a woman to eat the same foods every day throughout their cycle. We obviously have different needs. I mean, and different cravings, and to develop a customized program that sort of meets those nutritional requirements throughout those hormonal fluctuations is like super important. To allow that process to happen naturally, I think it's part of that, but also to just, balance brain chemistry and cravings and things. I think it's super important. So, awesome. And fasting, fasting is great. I tend to do well fasting, but I also noticed that when I really got into intermittent fasting, I started losing quite a bit of weight. Like for many years, I just maintained, I'm kind of tall, so I maintained like 220. And then I was intermittent fasting for a while. And I was like, wow. And I hadn't weighed myself in a while. I was down to like 212 and then 210. It's like, I could not maintain my weight, even though no matter how much I lifted or whatever, I just couldn't get enough calories.
Is muscle mass you were losing? Muscle mass or lean body mass you were losing?
Well, I think and maybe it's due to just, not do, I did kind of take a whole year off of lifting weights, but I was like doing body weight exercise and stuff too. But I don't feel like it's possible for me to maintain the certain level of muscle and strength doing intermittent fasting. I just can't get in enough calories. And, I think I do think it's super important to build and maintain as much muscle as possible going into, as we age now. I think it's like even more important now for age-related sarcopenia is a real thing. Like I see it in people that are aging, and they have to work harder to maintain that. And I don't have anything against hormone or testosterone replacement therapy, but it's not something I want to do for a long time, hopefully like in 10 years or so. I do take DHEA first thing in the morning, and I noticed I just got some hormones back and my testosterone was fine. But I just know like a lot of guys that in their like 30s and stuff, and some of them maybe have used like hormones in the past, but they're like on full blown HRT, like testosterone replacement therapy. And I don't want to go down that path if I don't have to for like another 10 years or so. And that can reverse, but then that comes with its own set of problems. Right. And then women have to navigate that too with hormone replacement therapy. Huge. I remember my mom going through endometriosis, having a hysterectomy and things like that. So that's, I'm glad I don't have to deal with that, but guys have their own issues, and the longer I can maintain a normal, natural hormone balance. And I think the ketogenic diet has helped me do that too. And keeping protein pretty high and adequate really helps too.
Yeah. And I agree with what you're saying, because especially directionally, when you can do things like lift weight, as you mentioned, heavy for women and men, and women who still think you're going to get bulky, I promise you don't have the testosterone. I tried. I was competing in figure. Like I tried. I didn't have enough T to get there. So you won't get bulky, but you will absolutely recomp. You will absolutely change your body composition. And we know that we become more anabolic. There's more anabolic resistance that develops as we age. So to your point, it's harder to grow muscle as we get older if you are not taking the right intervention. The testosterone declines. In men, it's there's this term, andropause, that kind of gets thrown around, which is supposed to be the analog to menopause, which of course is a much more gradual decline. Menopause is typically a much more sudden decline it's a gradual decline in progesterone we see kind of starting in the mid 30s. But with estradiol specifically and, estriol and estrone, we see like this sort of all of a sudden there's no more, like within a year, 6 months, there's no more. But I think resistance training directionally, of course, we know is going to increase your muscle protein synthesis. It's going to naturally increase your T levels, your estrogen levels. And then there's other really, these are some of the things that I get really excited about, because there's a lot of sort of strategies that you can implement that are relatively low cost. So things like getting early morning light, it has a hormonal balancing effect directionally. Whether you're a woman, it improves your estrogen to testosterone profiles. If you're a man, it improves your testosterone profiles. Things like nasal breathing, like there's all of these things that are,
I'm a huge fan of both. Yeah. I tape my mouth at night, and my wife thinks I'm crazy, but she's starting to, come around, and the first thing I do is, walk out barefoot and let the cows out and just get that bright Florida sunshine. I think that it resets, it activates the circadian clock in a way that I feel there's no doubt in my mind that, and I need to do this, I have a hormone kit, but levels of dopamine and serotonin are much higher in balance throughout the rest of the day when I get that, strong blast of sun coming up. I think it's super important. And, probably a lot of people just don't realize the importance of that. I think it's super important.
Yeah. And I love that you're always testing, because I think, if we're talking about this for men or women, when your testosterone does start to decline, it would be really useful for you to know what your T levels were when you were feeling good. Because again, for men, normal ranges is like 300 to 1200 nanograms per deciliter. It's like, that's a huge range, right? And someone at 500 could feel amazing. And you might have a natural baseline of 800, nanograms per and if you were to go down to 500, you would just be miserable and overweight and depressed, right? So I think,
you know what? I measured my testosterone I've been doing it a while, and I was in grad school and I was under a lot of stress. It could have been psychological stress. I was also working out a lot more. And I had like low normal testosterone, and I got it done when I was like hitting PRs. And I was like, wow, that's weird, because I was like really strong. And I think it might have been overtraining in that case. Whereas it was certain times where I was just kind of taking off. I never like completely take off. I always do some sort of exercise. But training also increases, and this is an important consideration. Training will dramatically increase androgen receptor density, at the level of the muscle. So if you are, and a couple of studies came out, and I think Lane Norton had talked about that. He's a friend of mine, maybe different opposing nutritional views in some way, but we're like on the same page 90%. But he reviewed it, and I went to the studies and looked at studies that you can have a testosterone range that is pretty low normal and still not really have any overt effects from that, at least from like a strength and muscle point of view. So I really believe that it's super important to train heavy, and to do it with a relative amount of frequency to increase your androgen receptor density at the level of the muscle. And then you could overcome, one guy could have 1,000, nanograms per deciliter or whatever testosterone, and 200 or 300. And, the guy with 200 or 300 that's training more, maybe getting more effective testosterone, just because the androgen receptor density you can move that a lot. You can increase it by like 200% or more just through training. So I think that's an important aspect for people to consider. Yeah.
One more topic I want to cover with you as it relates to the ketogenic diet in women, and is that my women with polycystic ovary syndrome. I have found observationally, clinically, that these are the women that respond the best to ketogenic protocols. And partially because I think, and this is size agnostic. It doesn't matter if the woman is overweight or she's of what would be considered a normal BMI, but there seems to be some correlation with insulin, hyperinsulinemia in these women, and the correction that having a low carbohydrate and therefore lower insulin response seems to offer them. I wanted to have your, some thoughts that you have on PCOS for women, as you were saying, increasing the androgen receptor density. One of the things I also tell my PCOS ladies is you have to lift, because this is going to increase your glucose disposal agent, your glucose sink, your muscles. The bigger that, the more hypertrophy that the more muscle that you have, the better glucose disposal agent you will be. And I think that there can be some confusion when you say, "Oh, if I increase my androgen, but I'm already hyperandrogenergic." So, can you speak a little bit to PCOS, the ketogenic diet, and potentially training as well?
Yeah, I've learned a lot from communicating with quite a few people that have PCOS, and I would go to the literature, and the study by, I think, Dr. Eric Westman from Duke, would come up, and then maybe a few others. And I see that on clinicaltrials.gov. I think there's a couple other studies going on. So in the blood work, and even in, pictures, in communicating with people, you have the classical, insulin resistance, truncal obesity, like that intraomental fat that you see, and then higher androgen levels. It's really about hormonal balance. So these women are very responsive to the ketogenic diet, which lowers insulin. And then through that's kind of like the springboard, or that's kind of the facilitator of balancing out many other hormones through, reducing insulin, hyperinsulinemia. So bringing insulin down, there's a little delay, but soon after that, all the other hormones, including testosterone, will go back into balance, and it'll start liberating some of that truncal, like that intraomental fat. And fat is it's important to acknowledge that fat is an endocrine organ, right? So it makes like inflammatory mediators that influence our other hormones, sex hormones and things like that. So as we start to, reduce our body fat, inflammation goes down, and inflammation contributes to insulin resistance. So it's multifactorial, but PCOS is one of those conditions that's very responsive in most cases to, it doesn't have to be the ketogenic diet, but that's the fastest way to reverse it. And some women with PCOS are in like really dire straits. They're like in pretty bad shape. So doing a ketogenic diet first, and then transitioning to like a low carb approach, which doesn't maybe necessarily have to be, ketogenic diet, all the time, but even, 50, 100 grams of carbs a day could probably maintain, the reversal of the PCOS once they do it. I've communicated like recently with people that tried everything, and then the ketogenic diet was the only thing that worked for them, and it worked quite well.
Mm-hmm. And then we also see improvements if we're taking, if we're looking at their hormones, we see improvements in their luteinizing, their FSH to LH ratios, right? Which is actually what you need to ovulate. You need that big differential in luteinizing hormone. And the ectopic fat distribution is a really big one as well, that central obesity. Because for women, even though we don't like it, we should have more weight in our sort of lower tummy, bum, hip area. But when it's sort of that apple, that central, like that spare tire sort of, distribution, you can run into a lot of issues there. I had Dr. Robert Lustig on the pod, and he was talking about visceral, like this, NAFLD and this like human foie gras, as he calls it, where we see, the central obesity is really often an indicator, and like your waist to hip ratio really being a good indicator. Very, free tool again, like waist and hip, divide the waist into the hip. It
is. It's very good. Yeah, actually. Yep.
Yeah. So just wanted to throw that out there as well.
Yeah, it's kind of, people look at it as like an aesthetic thing, but I think it's really important to acknowledge that it's really like a health and longevity thing. Yeah. So if you focus on that simple ratio biomarker and try to reduce, keeping books were written about this, I think by Dr. Oz back when I was like in college, like 25 years ago. It's like your waist. So these are simple things that you can do. And I think, to focus on, and, so some people are not going to measure ketones. Some people are not going to wear a CGM, although I think these are super valuable tools. They don't have to be, you don't have to wear a CGM for the rest of your life, but just simply wearing it for 2 weeks or 4 weeks, and looking at that insight, looking at the app, can be super valuable for that. So I tell people, and it's becoming more affordable now, that when they start a dietary program, and to wear like a CGM and to look at those changes and to see how food affects your glucose, which would be affecting your insulin, that's super valuable. And then that becomes a behavioral tool. So we have a clinical trial now using continuous glucose monitoring with the Levels app, actually. And we wrote it up using CGM as a behavioral tool. And I think it could be a very powerful behavioral tool when you can see quite literally what's happening to your glucose in real time.
100%. And we had Casey, Dr. Means on the podcast. And it's such a, when you can gamify it, like I know for you mentioned, like we were talking about wine before, I wear my Oura ring. If I get a ding on my HRV, like I know that I'm going to stay away from the things, like I'm going to make sure that I go to sleep at the same time, and I can be a little bit, maybe a little tyrannical about it, but but I know that, when I open my app the next day and it's syncing my data, I'm going to get that feedback. And I think the same is true for CGM, where if you know that you have a poor response to, I don't know, cauliflower or something, or almonds or whatever, then you're going to abstain from taking, because you're going to see that your, glucose, you're going to have that spike, and, you can start to correlate those spikes with, that interoceptive, like how you feel, how does it feel when you have this, when you're in this hyperglycemic state. And I think that it's hard if you don't have these tools sometimes guiding you, if you are not connected to your body. to be able to say, yeah, I feel a little woozy, or I feel a little, frenetic. A lot of people will say after wearing CGM that when they consume foods that they know that they don't process well, that they can say, yeah, I actually feel a little manic, or I feel a little nuts when I consume, X food or Y food. So.
And that's coming from you from a perfectly healthy, fine-tuned machine. And if you apply these wearable technologies and monitor sleep and monitor, glycemic response and exercise too, which is a valuable intervention for even, psychiatric disorders. We're having this conversation about bipolar, and I know I get consistent feedback that's the trigger is highly related to sleep hygiene and sleep, like sleep deprivation and diet, and certain things can trigger that. And if I am a doctor and I want to monitor my patients and have the best outcome for my patients, if I could just slap a CGM on them or just let them wear an Oura ring, and then I have oversight to see, if they're following a particular dietary intervention or they're getting healthy sleep. And if they're not getting healthy sleep, then I could see that correlates with, a manic episode or something like that, if we're looking at a behavioral disorder. But I mean, for type 2 diabetes too, if everybody in your family has it at age 50 and you're 40 and you don't want it, your doctor should send you out, a CGM, and then look it over, and then next, follow-up say, okay, what was your diet? Look at what you did here, whatever you did here, don't do that. These are simple things, and insurance companies can pay now, or they can pay later, pay a little bit now and get these relatively inexpensive devices out to patients to help prevent a potential problem from happening. And then once the problem happens and it can become a bigger problem with comorbidities and then hospitalizations. And I think, and I know companies like United Healthcare are kind of looking into this idea of preventative care. Like I'm a basic research scientist, and no one's going to develop a cancer prevention protocol or develop a diabetes prevention protocol. I mean, we need to fund not only basic science research, but we need to fund larger clinical trials, because prevention is a cure for many of these things. Yeah. So, and I think that's what you're doing really through the podcast and putting out this information, getting people healthy, maintaining them healthy to prevent age-related chronic diseases down the path. Exercise is a powerful tool too.
I know. Exercise. There's no drug that will ever match exercise, as far as I'm concerned. And my grandmother used to say something like, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So she was like the woman who would moisturize herself with olive oil and clean her house with vinegar before, we started talking about endocrine disrupting chemicals and all of that. So, Dom, there's so many more questions I had planned, but I want to be very respectful of your time. I want to thank you. Yeah, I want you to come back on. We want to talk about exercise, cholesterol. I have actually, admittedly, 30 more pages on this document that I haven't gotten to yet, but I'd love to have you back on. But thank you so much for your time today, your expertise. And I'm so excited, just as a professional, on a professional note, your work is I've followed your work for many, many years, and it's an honor to have this conversation with you. So really, really happy that we did.
Thank you for following me and having me on. I appreciate having this platform to speak to more women too. I know you have a huge women, and I think this information needs to get out to them. So it's an interesting topic that I'm learning about too. I was listening to your, I guess it was the menopause, or not menopause, but your cycle, the two series that you have discussing the menstruation cycle. So I need to brush up. I know the basic science, but there's a lot of little nuances that I don't know. And I think that information, I don't see anyone else putting it out there like you. So I think it's super valuable.
Thank you. I'm happy to geek out with you on that as well. Yeah.